Global Chit Chat, our weekly show where we discuss the biggest developments across the world over the last 7 days with our guest and experts, Trilateral Singh Maini. Sir, as always, thank you for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
At the top, sir, I want to discuss Afghanistan, keeping that in focus. The first multilateral meeting on the Afghanistan humanitarian crisis happened this week. Now, all many of the G20 countries, they met and they agreed that it is time to assist the Afghan people, if obviously not the government, even if that means that they have to coordinate with the Taliban towards that end. So what kind of engagement are we looking at between G20 major economies and the Afghanistan government? Can this engagement expand, and based on what conditions? Do you, sir, see the Taliban meeting any of those conditions?
Okay, so the first thing is, from a symbolic point of view, both Russia and China were not present at yesterday's meeting, right? And Russia is in fact hosting a conference on October 20th, a regional conference related to Afghanistan itself. Now, why I mentioned this is that there is a difference to some extent between Russia and the West, and there is a clear difference between China and the US, especially in terms of even the humanitarian assistance. So if you look at China, for instance, as we discussed earlier, China has even said that the sanctions against the Taliban need to be removed. The assets, again, this point is very important, that the reserves of the Central Afghan Bank, they need to be released. China is the only country to say that basically these assets belong to Afghanistan, it's time to release them. Yesterday, again, at the meeting, while there was a clear consensus in terms of providing humanitarian aid and assistance, the US, for instance, said that this should be channeled through international organizations. And there was a clear distinction again that, we're not going to do it. We don't want to have anything to do as such with the Taliban. It should be done through international organizations. And that is why we discussed earlier also that the US Department of Treasury had, issued 2 licenses to make it easier, basically, for providing humanitarian assistance by international organizations. So I think this difference in stance, specifically between China and the US, is something which you need to watch carefully. And it's also interesting that this meeting came also days after officials, US officials, and now obviously there is a clarity in terms of the providing humanitarian assistance, but there are still apprehensions over the nature of the government, that is non-inclusive, the rights of minorities, rights of women. That is a sticking point, right? So I think this difference is going to remain there now, and I don't see the US changing its stance with regard to the sanctions, and even many other countries are not going to change that. And significantly, even as far as Russia is concerned, for instance, obviously Russia is more on the same page vis-a-vis China, relatively, if I were to compare the Russia-China relations and Russia-US relations. But Russia also has said that in terms of recognition of the Taliban interim government, that is not on the table as yet, right? So these are interesting times, and I think the essential, it's becoming a, you can say China versus, I wouldn't say China versus the rest, certainly China versus the US sort of competition. And even because the Taliban has repeatedly also said that while it has said, as in earlier shows we discussed, that it wants good relations with the US, it has reiterated about the fact that it is most comfortable with China. So I think this, while it would be rather simplistic to look at it only in terms of binaries, but this is one thing which is apparent even from yesterday's meeting. Then you look at the issue of terrorism. Obviously, terrorism was also discussed, and terrorist threats emanating from Afghanistan and all. That was also discussed. And I think basically what essentially you have is you have a difference in opinion. That thing, the approach towards human rights issues between the West and China. That is quite apparent. Though China has repeatedly also said that, in terms of the rights of the women, especially in minorities and all, it has, but there's a difference in opinion, difference in approach of EU and US on the one hand and China on the other. But I think what you need essentially is that whatever public posturing may be there, you also cannot allow, I mean, other countries should also not allow, China to have a sort of free run, because as it is, engagement is going on with the Taliban. So both sides need to find a sort of middle path. And I think the sort of approach is essential. We need to sort of look at that. And now, what I think what is really important is the October 20th conference. What are the takeaways from that, and whether there is any progress, and whether there is any change in stance from either side, whether the Taliban can give more assurances, and whether those who are sticky about the sanctions remaining vis-a-vis the Taliban, whether they also change the stance.
Right. Next, though, I want to focus on Iran and Russia that have recently agreed to a strategic partnership. Iran has also recently concluded a similar one with China. So do you see...
that is very clear that you have a trilateral axis, between Iran, Russia, and China, right? And even if you look at the Iranian foreign minister's visit to Russia last week, there were discussions on Afghanistan, on the nuclear deal, on what all is going on in the South Caucasus, the security situation over there, the need for bilateral linkages, Iran's membership of the SCO. So a host of issues were discussed. But what we need to bear in mind is that when we talk about this axis, that there is a clear difference of opinion between Iran and Russia on the one hand, and China on the other vis-a-vis Afghanistan. So as I alluded to earlier, that Russia has categorically said that, it's still basically that recognition of the Taliban interim government is not on the table. It is still not satisfied with regard to the commitment. It's not assured. Basically the Taliban has not really fulfilled its commitment. So until it fulfills its commitments, that recognition is not there on the table. And I think the Russian foreign minister was very clear in stating this, right? Iran is worried about the non-inclusive nature, the fact that it shares borders, and the fact that, there could be, another sort of refugee problem which it faces if there's an influx of Afghans. So their views on certain issues naturally are different from that of China. China, on the other hand, it's put forward its own concerns categorically with regard to the ETIM to Taliban, even before the Taliban had taken over. But on the other hand, as I said, it said about the sanctions, that you need to ease them out, you need to release the reserves, and you should let Afghanistan decide its own future course. That has to do with, obviously, China's own economic interests in the natural resources, in the Belt and Road Initiative. So what do we have? When you look at this trilateral, we also must look also at the US approach now towards Russia in recent months. So the US realizes that Russia is an important intermediary for Afghanistan. So basically, if you look at on the day, I think the Iranian foreign minister landed in Moscow, I think hours before that, the US Secretary of State and the Russian foreign minister had a conversation on with regard to the JCPOA. Similarly, on Afghanistan, also, obviously, Russia has an important role to play. Now, the other thing is, when you talk about this axis, so on the one hand, US has opened out a bit towards Russia. This is because a lot of US analysts have been suggesting that you cannot have a similar approach towards Russia as you have vis-a-vis China, because there are, with Russia, there are clear areas where you can cooperate. There are many differences due to the developments in the last years, but there are clear differences. Then Russia has good relations with a lot of countries which also have good ties with the US. So there is there's credibility also that way. So I think through the recent developments, through what has happened in Afghanistan and Beijing, then there is, say, between Iran and the US, or Moscow and the US. But there are very important fault lines, right? Now I will give you a simple example. So for instance, Iran has very good relations. Iran has good relations with India, right? And it has good relations with China. So this axis part in the present geopolitical situation, and as we've said, the way the world order is changing, it's very tough to talk about a clear axis. There are always going to be differences and everything. And even if you look at the geopolitical situation of the region itself, Iran's ties with Pakistan, Iran's ties with Afghanistan, there are a lot of complications involved therein. So now the next thing is, I think more if you look at it from Iran's point of view, there's apprehensions, because in the past the worry was that what the arguments were that you don't want to kowtow to the US, but you shouldn't either be kowtowing or playing second fiddle to China. And obviously there were also issues with the 25-year agreement which was signed with China, that it was not transparent enough and all. So obviously the new government in Iran will have to tread a careful path. But I think this strategically it's important in the bilateral context as well as in the regional context as well.
Right. And so the last question I want to ask you today is about the Southeast Asian nations opening up, easing curbs and opening up for tourism. So do you think that they've decided to cautiously just live with the virus and open up the economy?
So I think if you look at if you look at the economies of ASEAN countries, obviously the tertiary sector in general and the tourism in particular contributes a large percentage. So that's one thing which you need to look at. Obviously, in recent days, if you look at countries like Thailand, if you look at Vietnam, if you look at Malaysia, it has had a large number. I mean, tourists. There has been a sudden rise in the tourists from China, and even from India for that matter, especially to Thailand and to Malaysia and everything. Now, what ASEAN is doing is it is opening up in a very, the very sort of interesting approaches. So, for instance, if we look at Thailand, Vietnam is also following that model that you open up the tourist destinations, and obviously there are select countries in this, right? But now the question is that for how do you strike a balance between your economic interests and safety as well? Because you may consider that, for instance, 8 countries which you've opened up to, let's say, that there are high rates of vaccination, the numbers have gone down. Right. But there may be others also which, have had the same rates of vaccination. But there's a mental block vis-a-vis certain countries, and, because of stereotypical sort of thing, But actually, it is those countries which really send large number of tourists. So till what point are ASEAN countries going to only stick with the normal, approach of first opening up to Western countries? Because the tourists are coming actually from China and from India, especially if you look at a country like Thailand. So, in fact, if you look at the rise in number of tourists, I think in 2010, ASEAN had, I think, about 2.5 million arrivals from India. By 2019, that number was well over 5 million, 5.3 or something. Okay. Now, also, of course, this is much lower, by the way, than the number of Chinese tourists. Chinese tourists in 2019 were 32 million, 1/6. But if you look at it, slowly you're catching up, especially in Thailand and all. Now, the question is, will ASEAN countries also, especially I'm talking about Thailand and Vietnam and all, will they also begin to open up to South Asian nations soon, or are they going to just stick to? Because one, from the point of view of, as I said, the growth in the number of tourists from South Asia, obviously it's important. And second, geographically, obviously the linkages, not just, if you look at Southeast Asia and the linkages with South Asia, be it India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and all, at some stage you will have to look at that as well. So I think what I suspect is that with Dubai also, Dubai having opened up, UAE having opened up, I don't think a lot of ASEAN countries want to lose out even on Indian tourists. And with conditions, I think the next stage is going to be that, especially Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Now, the problem is going to again be about, obviously, then Covishield, there should be no issue. But those who've got vaccinated with the Covaxin, because as yet, it's being said that, the Covaxin will also get WHO approval, but as yet it hasn't received. So when that happens, I think then you could see a sudden rise. And that's also good because a lot of now, with things picking up, with some sort of normalization taking place, a lot of people would want to visit ASEAN countries. And the fact is that if they're opening up in a restricted manner and they're opening up few places, I think that even the safety of the tourists has also been ensured.
Right. So, Trilateral sir, I will leave it there for this week. Thanks very much once again for breaking down geopolitics for us. And for our viewers, request you to tune in to our show next week as well. Thank you. Thank you.
Subscribe to One India channel and never miss